Historically, colonialism was when white European nations went into Africa and what is now the Americas and the Caribbean, set up shop, stole a bunch of shit, enslaved entire communities, and then claimed the land as their own. This history of colonial exploitation is deeply tied to our current situation in America today. Modern capitalism was not built because of some weird Anglo-Western exceptionalism or superiority. This level of development and industrialization in the West happened so quickly because there was little to no money being spent when it came to the workers. The slave-owning class was successful financially because they were willing to engage in the immoral act of enslaving people, something that people knew was completely morally wrong even back then. The capitalist system as we know it today is quite literally built on the backs of African slaves. It was only when slavery and the raw colonial approach became less profitable and manageable that blacks were allowed to participate as wage slaves in the capitalist economy. So why does all this matter?
Hello family, welcome to African Esquire TV, and I'm your host Tierney Cherie. So as I talked about in my previous video, I want to talk about the fact that Africans in the United States, we have to start looking at ourselves as being a colonized people. And this is something that I've always said, but I started thinking about more recently, in that we have to specifically focus on this colonial relationship that we have to the United States government. Now, if you look at what's happening in Black America, a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us live inside of communities that are poor. A lot of us live inside of communities that are crowded. A lot of us living inside of communities that do not have economic means in order to uplift our people outside of this community, or even just better the community. We don't have the same means that other communities have. So when you start looking at that, and you start looking at the fact that Black people in the United States, we don't really have institutions. So we don't have schools really. And these are, I'm going to make some blanket statements because of course we do have some schools, but I'm making blanket statements to cover to characterize the overall situation. So, you know, of course there are going to be some schools, but overall we do not have Black schools. We do not have schools that are ran by Black people, completely independent of the government, that can actually provide a good education for us overall. While there are certainly some great private Black schools, a lot of us do not have access to those institutions. Similarly, we do not have Black banks. And of course there are exceptions, but overall we do not have the ownership of banks inside of our community. We do not have the ownership of restaurants inside of our community. Overall, you'll see things like a lot of foreign restaurants. For example, a lot of Chinese people own the restaurants in our community that our people frequent the most. So in addition, you look at our hair care, you know, the Black woman, you know, we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on our hair collectively. We do not have ownership of the hair shops inside of our communities. We don't have ownership of the nail shops inside of our community. So these are just some businesses that we frequent very often. The grocery stores, a lot of times we don't have ownership of the grocery stores. A lot of times you will see people of Arabic backgrounds who have ownership of our grocery stores and not people who actually live in that community. Now, when it comes to those people, whether it's the Chinese or the Arabs who have ownership of those stores, the problem with that, the big problem with that is that when those people get our money, get money from us, they don't get that money and then live inside of the same community. Instead, they get that money and live somewhere else. And so that money that could be put into the taxes that are raised from our people is taken somewhere else. And so their money is taken from us and it goes to another community that is now our own communities. So the businesses inside of the black communities are not owned by us. Similarly, we don't own the gas stations. We don't have ownership of a lot of things that we depend on to live off of the side of our communities. So that in itself means that we are inside of a position where we are being exploited. We are inside of a position, we are at the bottom of the barrel, and we are inside of a position that we are dependent on others in order to live. We are dependent on others in order to survive. Now, remember that part, we're dependent on others, because we're going to look at some examples of colonialism and all of this to say why Black people in the U.S. are colonized. So this is from National Geographic. They say colonialism is defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. It occurs when one nation subjugates another, conquering its population and exploiting it, often while forcing its own language and cultural values upon its people. Now, This, of course, is our reality just by way of slavery. We were not just taken from Africa. We were taken from Africa to be colonized. Particularly, pay attention to this point. The concept of colonialism is closely linked to that of imperialism, which is the policy or ethos of using power and influence to control another nation or people that underlies colonialism. Now, a part of this also is that we have to recognize that we have been another nation, a nation within a nation. Because the fact is that while we have been in the United States, a lot of us have not had the pleasures of the United States. A lot of us have not had the benefits of the United States. A lot of us have been pushed into these ghettos where we are a nation that is exploited by the outside nation. So if you look at other colonized countries, for example, you'll see that although they might have some type of connection to the colonial power, and I'm speaking in the context of neocolonialism also, they still are relegated to their plotted land where they are controlled, where the politics of their community are controlled, where the economic exploitation of their community is controlled by the outside. And that's still our situation in the United States. Despite the fact that technically, you could always just move to a white neighborhood, those people who do move out and disconnect from the black community, those people are not, those people can join in to a certain extent with the outside community, but they do not disrupt the same social order of black people being confined to the ghettos. Meaning, all because I might move on up and might go to a white community where I feel like I'm having the benefits of the country, it doesn't disrupt the caste system in the United States that has still relegated most of my people to being a nation within a nation, and not just a nation within a nation, a colonized nation within a nation. So I want to look a little bit more into the types of colonialism, just to break this down a little further. So I'm on Wikipedia, by the way. Historians generally distinguish two main varieties established by colonial settler colonialism, meaning what happened whenever you have places like South Africa. They didn't just come to the country and then leave. They came to the country and said, okay, this is our country now. And not just settler colonialism, but exploitation colonialism. So I would say, and I know some of my people believe that black people are the Native Americans, and I'm not talking about that, but I believe that we could relate to the exploitation colonialism. So exploitation colonialism is a form of colonialism where foreign citizens conquer a country in order to control and capitalize on its natural resources and indigenous population. Now, I also want to point out the fact that while we were taken from Africa and obviously deprived of a lot of our natural resources, the one natural resource that we still have and that's still being exploited is labor. We have to look at our labor as a resource that's being exploited by the power structure. In what ways is labor being exploited? Well, if you look at the prison industrial complex, that is an exploitation of our labor. Black people are working for a few dollars an hour or a few cents an hour by force for these big corporations. And that's one of the ways that they've been able to keep some corporations from going to foreign countries and saying, hey, well, you can use our prison labor in order to continue making money off of the United States instead of going and using other people in other countries in order to make your products. So our labor has been our natural resource. Here's a quote from, it says, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, who argued that institutions established by colonials did not introduce much protection for private property, nor did they provide checks and balances against government expropriation. In fact, the main purpose of the extractive states was to transfer as much of the resources of the colony to the colonizer with the minimum amount of investment in the people. So if you look at what happens in black communities, what happens? We're basically being used inside of so many industries, not just in prisons. We're being used inside of the NFL, for example. We're being used inside of inside of music. We're being used inside of so many industries where we're found useful, but we're being used with minimum investment going to the same black communities that we were taken from, that we left. So this is a very key part of colonialism, is that it's not just taking things from people. It's not just using people. It's not just relegating them in exploitation and relegating them to living as if they are a lower caste of people. That's a part of it, but the other part is doing so without returning the investment, returning the labor, returning the goods that were taken to those people and investing inside of those communities so that they can actually survive. You're kind of choking the people. That is a major part of the situation, of the connection, because if we look at it, you know, if the Black community wasn't so exploited as it is in the US, how would they be able to exert control over us inside of different industries? For example, whenever you look at the things like the NFL, why haven't the players revolted and said, you know what, we're going to start our own? Well, there's a big fear that if we are not being given money, if we're not being given capital from these institutions, that we could be pushed back into the same position that we were in. So there's always a threat of being returned back to the Black community. There's always a threat of being returned back into the situation where you were taken from. And that's part of the way that they keep up this connection of exploitation versus, or exploited versus exploitator, because there's always a fear of being sent back to the plantation, being sent back to be like the others. That's something that motivates us in order to uplift this system, because a lot of people, you'll notice, inside of our communities, they won't speak out against the system. They won't speak out against white supremacy because they feel like the Black community has nothing to offer them. They feel like Wall Street has everything to offer them. They feel like these Fortune 500 companies have everything to offer them, but they do not feel like the Black community has anything to offer them. So they want to keep our communities being exploited. They want to keep our communities having minimum investment, because it would mess up the causal relationship of exploitation if they were to change the dynamics that exist from there. Now, to continue on, I want to talk about this issue, and this is particularly going with our politics of indirect rule versus the direct rule of colonial political systems. So indirect rule, in certain cases, such as India, when India was colonized, the colonial power directed all decisions related to foreign policy and defense, while the indigenous population controlled most aspects of internal administration. So how does this relate to our people? So if you look at a lot of us live inside of cities that are ruled, or not to say ruled, that are being led by Black mayors, Black governors, cities that are not being are not being controlled by white people per se, as far as the face of the cities, but still, the system is still the same system, and in particular, the outside system is still relegating the inside system. They'll allow certain concessions, and particularly, they'll allow certain concessions in order to keep us from rising up against the system. And one of the big concessions that are always allowed is they will allow you to have the good feeling of feeling like at least my ruler is someone who is from my tribe. Meaning, at least my ruler is someone who is from my community. Otherwise, you know, if it was just always putting a white face inside of the power structure, putting a white face in front of us, then we might feel more of a need to rebel. We might feel a bit more of a need to push back. But it's kind of a good way to pacify us in order to make us feel like we're inside of somewhere that's representing us. You know, this idea of democracy is representation. So if you feel pacified, if you feel like you're being represented in local politics, you won't take so much issue with the fact that you're absolutely not being represented. In particular, when you look at national politics, you're not being represented, but also in those same local politics, you're not being represented. I'll always remember being in Baltimore during the whole Freddie Gray thing, because there was a Black mayor of Baltimore. I forget, what was her name? I don't want to say the wrong name, but there's a Black mayor of Baltimore. There's a Black prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby. I remember her. There were Black faces already all over the political scheme of Baltimore. Yet at the same time, you couldn't get a conviction against a cop who killed this boy inside of cop custody. And that was just the norm, because the fact is that having a Black face inside of a political office does not mean that you're getting any type of true representation. And this applies to all Black politicians. This applies even to whenever we had a Black president. That did not change. Obama being president did not change anything about my community. I can tell you that. If it changed your community, please tell me how. Tell me how your community is less impoverished than it was whenever he went in. Tell me how your community has improved its education. It has improved the dynamics between the citizens and the police. Tell me how his presidency has improved your situation. So we have to understand that that is a major tenet of colonialism. The fact that they might put someone who looks like you inside of positions to make you feel like you're being represented, but in actuality and truth, you're not being represented. Now, just for this sake, I'm going to talk about direct rule. In a system of direct rule, European colonial officers oversaw all aspects of governance, while natives were placed in an entirely subordinate role. Unlike indirect rule, the colonial government did not convey orders through local elites, but rather oversaw administration directly. And that would be something very reminiscent of slavery, because there was no, ifs, ands, or buts about it. We had a plantation owner who ruled us. That was the situation. There was no else. There was no, okay, what about this? What about that? That was what it was. And so it was more, it was explicit. It was more direct, and that was what they used in order to rule us at that time. But understand that direct rule versus indirect rule does not necessarily mean that you're not being colonized. In fact, it's a better way to colonize you indirectly, because you're not as understanding that you're being exploited. You're not as understanding that you're being enslaved. So indirect rule, in a lot of ways, helps the power structure to, I would say, exploit you longer and then pacify you while they're exploiting you, because you're not necessarily aware that you're being exploited. A lot of us get into the symbolism thing, and we have to break out of that symbolism, the affinity for symbolism, because all symbolism does is pacify us in order to make us feel like we're doing better even when we're not. Having an African American museum in Washington, has that done anything for Black people? No. People talking about having Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill, is that going to do anything for us? No. Having, Black people win Oscars, has that done anything for us? No. All it does is make you feel better. It makes you it pacifies you about your situation, but it doesn't do anything for our situation, because we have to get to a point where even Tyler Perry, he opened a new studio in Atlanta. Great accomplishment, by all means. He worked very hard for that. But guess what? That does not change the situation of Black people in Atlanta. It doesn't change the situation of Black people anywhere. These symbols, we have to get out of the love of symbols. We have to instead be in love with actual change and with actual revolutionary outcomes. That should be the only thing that we all gather and we're celebrating. We're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. That should be more what we're about. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this out, and I'm going to start pushing this a lot more on this channel, is that we have to identify ourselves not just as people who are enslaved, but as people who are colonized. As I said, other colonial countries that were colonized were also enslaved. But the difference is we were taken outside of those countries and meant to be slaves inside of the United States. Now, a boat ride does not differentiate you instead of in the aspect of exploitation, clearly, because wherever you go, whether it's inside of America or whether you go to the Caribbean or whether you go to Africa, we're all still being exploited the same as we were back whenever we were taken from there. So the commonality of colonialism is something that we can all unite around. Also, you have to think about the fact that our people in the U.S., we do not have the numbers in order to take on this higher global white supremacist system. We don't have the numbers by ourselves. And we, again, as I said in my previous video, we have to think about the fact that this is not just in the U.S., this is global. Understand, before the United States was the United States, it was a colony of England. Understand, England was just not in the slave trade on its own. It was in the slave trade with France. It was in the slave trade with Belgium. It was in the slave trade with basically all of Western Europe. So these are not just isolated things. We're not just coming against a white supremacist system in this country. We're talking about a global system, and we do not have those numbers to fight that, nor do we have the resources to fight that. But together we can build ourselves and we can organize ourselves to where we can actually stand a real threat to the system that has been exploiting us for hundreds of years. Now, the other thing, though, is that when we're talking about human rights, we're talking about the right to not be colonized, the right to self-determination. These are common goals. These are things that we do not that we would be foolish to me to think that it only applies to ourselves inside of certain contexts and certain states. There are some people who are, I never understood, they're only activists inside of their particular city. And it's like, you don't see all these black communities fighting the same thing that you are fighting, and they'll only speak about things in their city instead of speaking about things about black people collectively. But how much more powerful would it be if we start speaking collectively, understanding that our struggle here is reminiscent of what is happening every single place where African people are. So I say this to say that we as black people, we have to stop allowing ourselves to be separated as if we were not colonized, separated as if our only identity is being enslaved in the United States, not understanding that this was only one of many types of exploitation by the white supremacist system. This was only one example of what happened to African people around the world. If we start understanding this and we start organizing, knowing this, then we actually stand a real threat to the system. And moreover, we actually stand a chance, because the way that things are going right now, we don't stand a chance of actually obtaining self-determination. If our only way of fighting is waiting for the police to kill one of us, and then after the police gets one of us, we all gather and we start protesting, and then what happens is things die down. After a while, someone the police gets off, he gets found not guilty, and then all of a sudden we want to protest again until we realize that there's no point in protesting because he's already found not guilty, and then we all just go back to normal until someone dies again. That's unfortunately has been the extent to political movement that I've seen in these past 10 years. Yeah, we're not talking and organizing about doing something to where we don't get to that point, doing something to where we as a people have self-determination, where we have control over the police in our communities, and where we can actually raise a real cry for human rights of our people, not just inside of our small country. In the United States is not small, but our population in the U.S. is small. Not just inside of our small population, but inside of a global context. This, to me, is the only thing that we could do differently that we're not doing today, because a lot of people can talk about black people being killed by the police, but they're not drawing the connection to the fact that we are not one people, but we are many people. I'm going to close by reading an article, and this is an article read by, I believe, an African brother, but I thought it was a good representation of the fact that we have to identify ourselves as colonized, not just where we are, but as a people globally. So this is an article written by Chigozie Obioma, and it is on foreignpolicy.com. There are no successful black nations. He starts saying, in the wake of fresh deaths at the hands of police in the world's greatest nation, we the people of the black race are once again the object of renewed worldwide attention. Questions of injustice in the United States have been duly raised and protested, and once again the black cultural elites in the U.S. have seized various platforms to air their grievances and are mostly and rightly talking about racism, discrimination, racial profiling, and hate, among other issues. But one issue that has hardly been talked about is the core reason why black people have remained synonymous with the denigrating experience of racism. It is, I dare say, because of the worldwide dignity of the black race. So, as he's saying, we're all anxious to label this racism. We're anxious to label this discrimination. But we're not anxious to call out the fact that this is not just in the United States. It's something that is indicative of the black race wherever we go. He goes on to say that racism is not limited to the United States. There is no non-black nation ever among the most liberal, even among the most liberal ones, where the black man is dignified. History dealt us an unforgiving blow in the inclusion of foreigners into black lands. The Arabs enslaved tribes and nations and then colonized and evangelized them. And then came the Europeans who persuaded the Africans that they were the inferior race, divided up the continent over lunch in Berlin in 1884. And they carted off a large population of its people, sometimes leaving entire villages almost empty, and brought those who remained on the continent under their rule. So complete was the transformation that no black nation retained its ancestral nationhood, national language, or national identity. And today we often hear how China or India or some other nation is taking over Africa's economy. There is almost no nation whose majority is of a different race that has not spat on the face of the black person at one time or another. And of course, this is very reminiscent of things that we have gone through inside of the black communities of the U.S. Because in the same way that you've had Africa go through exploitation by the Arabs, exploitation by the Europeans, and now exploitation by the Chinese and India, how similar is that to us? We have already gone through white supremacy and slavery, and now we have other people from other communities going into our communities and having the role of gentrifying our communities, having the role of exploiting our communities, taking our money and going back to their own communities. All of these communities have played a part in us, and the common thread is that we are not empowered. We are not taking power for ourselves. Instead, we are being a victim of the ambitions of outsiders. That is so reminiscent of what is going on with us in the United States and also what is going on inside of Africa. Now, I want to scroll down a little bit. And it says, early African American intellectuals and cultural elites said that the future of their race could not be advanced by endless protests or marches of equality or justice. It can only be done through the exploration of the trampled dignity of the black men. Great men like Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Malcolm X all knew that a people is only respected when it has a nation worthy of respect. A man who lives in a shack cannot expect to be treated with respect as a palace. They knew that for us to reclaim power, we must reclaim dignity, and that this comes through the construction of a solid black state with a demonstrable level of development and prosperity, in which can stand as a powerful advocate for the global black. I'm going to stop right there, and the whole article will be posted inside of the description and also on AfricanEsquireTV.com. But this is basically what we have to keep in mind, is that our struggle has always been linked to Africa, whether or not we know it. Our struggle as a people has always been linked to the fact that we don't have a strong black-led country anywhere in the world, whether it's inside of Jamaica, whether it's inside of the Caribbean, wherever it is. Similarly, us in the United States, we are not a strong black nation. As I said, we are a nation within a nation. So there's a common thread going on with this, and we have to identify it, and we have to speak out about it. Because how else are we going to come together if we're not recognizing that we have been weakened wherever we go? The only solution is Pan-Africanism, for us to get out of the state that we are in, for us to get out of the state of being colonized. Because African people understand we are for colonialism to them. That's what we are. We're for exploitation. We're for this. This is what we were here for. No matter where we go, no matter what country we go to, you have black people move to China. From the U.S. to China, they still face the same racism. You have black people move from the U.S. to Europe, they still face the same racism, because that is the common thread. They see us as for that purpose. So let's identify ourselves correctly. We weren't just enslaved, we were colonized, and we still are being colonized inside of our communities, and we are still being treated as a people without our own separate identity. So that's all I have on this subject, you guys. I will see you all in another video.